Okay, we're going to get started here. My name is Evan Weiner, and thank you for being here today. Tomorrow is the 4th of July, and that's the bicentennial year that we're going back to, 1976. It's hard to believe that the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence is just 3 years from now. But we'll go back. The events of 1976 included a presidential campaign between Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford, the only president of the United States never to be elected, either president or vice president of the United States, and he is running in 1976. Bicentennial. I don't know how many of you remember being in the bicentennial celebration.
I was down at Battery.
You were down there, so you must have seen my wife among the 2 million people, because she was there that day too. And
I had relatives who had a
Oh.
hospitalized apartment.
oh, okay, so you were in the apartment, so you weren't there.
So we were watching.
Yeah. Mao Zedong dies. The United States and China opened up relations with one another during the latter part of his life, with Richard Nixon going there in the early 1970s. There was the rescue at Entebbe by the Israeli army at the airport in Uganda. The 1976 Olympics featured an Olympic boycott in Montreal. African countries boycotting that because of apartheid, South Africa. Apple starts, and there's Steve Jobs. And here is my, well, I can pull it out. Here's my Apple piece of work. Ebola was a problem in Africa. Legionnaire's disease was a problem in Philadelphia, and I know that for a fact because I was going out with somebody from Cherry Hill, New Jersey, whose father was the head of the IRS branch in Philadelphia, so I was down there that summer. Swine flu. I don't know if you remember the swine flu shots, but swine flu was supposed to be a big deal. There would be 17 Democrats who were seeking the presidential nomination in 1976. Among them is Jimmy Carter over there. Senator Birch Bayh of Indiana. Oklahoma Senator Fred Harris. Minnesota Senator Walter Mondale. Idaho Senator Frank Church. Washington Senator Henry Scoop Jackson. The Arizona Representative Marsh Udell. The former ambassador to France and John F. Kennedy's brother-in-law, Sergeant Shriver. The former North Carolina Governor, Terry Sanford. The former Alabama Governor, George Wallace, who was shot in 1972. He also is running, along with the West Virginia Senator, Robert Byrd, the former Georgia Governor, Jimmy Carter, the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C. Delegate to Congress, William Edward Fauntleroy, the Washington Mayor, Walter Washington, Texas Senator Lloyd Bentsen, the Pennsylvania Governor, Milton Schaap, and the California Governor, Jerry Brown, all threw their hats into the ring. On January 19th, Carter defeated Birch Bayh by a 2-to-1 margin in Iowa, and he's on his way. Jackson and Udell barely registered. Carter takes New Hampshire. Udell comes in second, Bayh comes in third. Carter was the front runner, and the other candidates all dropped out. Carter would be the Democratic nominee by June 8th, and that's when campaigns didn't start 3 years prior to the presidential election the way they do today. So much so that there's going to be a debate in August, 14 months before the election. A debate. Anyway, it would be Ford against Ronald Reagan for the Republican nomination. Reagan decided to throw his hat in the ring, even though Ford was the incumbent. On day 2 of the 1976 Republican National Convention, nobody seemed to know who was going to be the nominee. Was it going to be the incumbent, the sitting president who was never elected as vice president or president, Gerald Ford, or his challenger, the former actor, the former head of the Screen Actors Guild, the California governor, Ronald Reagan. Ford, as I said, was never elected president or vice president. He's the accidental president. Richard Nixon appointed Ford as the vice president in December of 1973 because the number two, Spiro Agnew, had a scandal going on. Seemed like everybody in that branch of the government had a scandal going on in the 1970s, early 70s. Anyway, he resigned in October of 1973. He took kickbacks as governor of Maryland, and he was caught by 1973, so he's gone. The Watergate scandal forced Nixon to step down on August 4th, 1974, and the former House Minority Leader, Gerald Ford of Michigan, becomes the country's first unelected president. On September 9th, 1974, Nixon says goodbye. I dealt with Nixon, starting in 1985, settled the baseball umpires dispute, and was brought back into proper society. Because of that, in 1985, he becomes, quote unquote, a senior statesman. But I'm getting ahead of the story. 1976, that's Ford's first presidential campaign. And his pardoning of Nixon for crimes related to the Watergate break-in hurt his standing among voters. And he lacked strong support within the Republican Party, partly because of that. Ford would win the nomination. He got 1,187 delegates, and Reagan got 1,070. The Republicans, obviously damaged by Watergate, and the state of the economy, which was not very good. In fact, one of the reasons Nixon broke into the Watergate was the economy, because he wanted to dig up dirt on the opponent, or he thought would be his opponent, the Maine Senator Edmund Muskie. The Democratic victor faced a Republican candidate who was barely standing as a result of bruising attacks he endured from Reagan in the primaries. The economy was a major issue, as was abortion after the 1973 U.S. Supreme Court Roe v. Wade ruling, and then there was the character of the candidates. Gerald Ford is a buffoon. That is at least his public persona because of a television show. Many of you remember when Saturday Night Live debuted in 1975. Remember the not ready for primetime players, one of whom is Chevy Chase. And Chevy Chase portrays a bumbling Ford. And why was he doing this? Well, Gerald Ford slipped down the steps of Air Force One in Austria in 1975. That slip, combined with NBC's Saturday Night Weekend Update anchor Chevy Chase's portrayal of Ford, he was a stumbling, bumbling fool. And because of a TV show, a Saturday night comedy show that wasn't seen by a wide audience, because it wasn't a wide audience, on Saturday night at 11:30, 10:30 Central Time, Ford becomes a bumbling, stumbling fool. All because of one character, Chevy Chase. Oh, and Jimmy Carter talked about, again, there's an interview, Playboy magazine, when Playboy mattered. Well, I was 20, it didn't matter to me. It mattered a few years earlier, though. I heard that kids my age used to sneak it underneath the bed so nobody would know that they're reading Playboy. Never did that. I just heard that happened. You know, did that happen? Do you know? I don't know, your kids or whatever. Anyway, the real Jimmy Carter on politics, religion, press, and sex in an incredible Playboy interview. And back in those days, Playboy was a big deal. It was a literary magazine that featured cartoons and naked women, but it was a big deal. In the Playboy interview, Carter admitted to having looked upon lots of women with lust. I've committed adultery in my heart many times. This is something God recognizes I will do, and I have done it, and God forgives me for it. Well, that becomes a matter of, does he have the kind of character that we want? in terms of President of the United States. Meanwhile, that's not Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, is it? But they're dancing, right? Nah, that's Liz and Jerry. That's a couple days after the, Queen Elizabeth II was in Boston on July 4th, 1976, celebrating with Bostonians the Declaration of Independence. She was in town while the festivities were going on, and then a few days later, she's down in Washington, D.C. Ford took advantage of the nation's bicentennial celebration campaign from the White House until October, using state dinners for Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip as backdrops for a Rose Garden strategy, presenting the president as a tested leader. He had other state dinners there. Meanwhile, remember Mr. Peanut? How many of you went down to Atlantic City and used to see Mr. Peanut on the boardwalk in Atlantic City? Mr. Peanut, there you go. Jimmy Carter was Mr. Peanut. He was a peanut farmer. Carter embraced the image of a rural hick in a strategy calculated to portray himself as the quintessential Washington outsider. His campaign headquarters was at an old train depot in his hometown of Plains, Georgia. And, well, if you were around Gerald Ford or Republicans in Washington, they give you this button to wear on your suit or whatever. Whip inflation now. Win. That was a strategy, a public relations strategy. Wow. Really, I mean, if you think of it, a button? What are you doing with a button? Have a policy, right? Whip inflation now. Win buttons immediately became objects of ridicule. They're probably worth a lot of money now if you could find one. Skeptics wore the buttons upside down, explaining that NIM stood for No Immediate Miracles, Non-Stop Inflation Merry-Go-Round, need money immediately. The 1973 through 75 recession, or the 1970 recession, was a period of economic stagnation in much of the Western world during the 1970s, putting an end to the overall post-World War II economic expansion, which started to peter out around 1958. High unemployment and high inflation existed. The recession ended in March of 1975, but the unemployment rate in May of 75 was still 9%. Presidential debates. Well, I had a friend by the name of Rennie Henry who put together one of the presidential debates, who I'm going to see in Seattle in a few weeks. My daughter is having a baby and I have to go out to Seattle. Rennie is about 90 years old now, but he put together that third presidential debate between Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford. And I'm going to let you in, back in those days when the Women's League of Voters sponsored this, a little bit behind the curtain of the presidential debate. There were 3 presidential debates. It was the first time in 16 years since Nixon and Kennedy, 1960, they did 4 debates that year, engaged in general election debates, and the first time an incumbent president participated. The first debate devoted to domestic policy. The second to international policy. The third, any topic. Any topic. And that was my friend Rennie. He put together the third one, William and Mary College in Virginia. And there he is. There's my friend Rennie. Like I said, I'm going to see him in a couple of weeks. First time since prior to COVID that I'm going to see him, so it's going to be nice to see him. And he put together the third debate. The president, and this is him talking, President William and Mary called me and told me they just learned William and Mary would be the site of the debate. He asked if I would come to Williamsburg and handle all press ops and guide the college of what it should and should not do. Rennie had a tight coordination with the head of the FBI, the head of operations for the FBI. The day of the event, Ford decided he would go to the basketball arena after the debate, regardless of what Carter was going to do. I worked with the FBI on how we would handle the event. Remember this character from Saturday Night Live? Baba Wawa, she was there, Baba Wawa. And this was Rennie's impression of Barbara Wawa, or Barbara Walters, which a lot of people had. A lot of people have told me who work with her, smartest person in the room. Without doubt, the smartest person in the room. Worked hard, had a personality, would turn off anybody. But she was the smartest person. She was a hard worker, but personality-wise, tough to deal with. This is Reddit. When the media kit was ready, I made a point of making the rounds to key network news people. Roger Mudd was anchor there for CBS, and I caught him at a good time. Looking for Barbara Walters, I saw at the end of a long, empty room, walked in to introduce myself and gave her a media kit and gave information on how to reach me if she needed me at all. Before I could get halfway through introducing myself, she interrupted, cut me off, and said in substance, "I'll call you if I need you." And with that, she swished me away. She's always been Baba Wawa, thanks to Saturday Night Live. Well, did the debates help either candidate? Yes or no? Well, hard to say. In the response to a question asked by Max Frankel of the New York Times concerning the Soviet, remember there was a Soviet Union in those days, influence in Eastern Europe, Ford said, "There's no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, and there never will be under a Ford administration." Frankel responded, "I'm sorry, did I understand you to say, sir, that the Soviets are not using Eastern Europe as their own sphere of influence in occupying most of the countries there?" This is the, you made a stupid answer. I'm going to try to bail you out, and you cover your rear end. This is a journalistic technique. If you like the guy or you want to think you need to give the guy a fair shake, you do this. You just say, "Hey, wait a minute, what did I just hear? Let me re-ask that question," and ask him, "Did you really mean that?" Instead of just saying, he meant it. Well, Frankel says that. Ford responses, "I don't believe that the Yugoslavians consider themselves dominated by the Soviet Union. I don't believe that the Romanians consider themselves dominated by the Soviet Union. I don't believe that the Poles consider themselves dominated by the Soviet Union. Each of these countries is independent, autonomous, it has its own territorial integrity, and the United States does not concede that those countries are under the domination of the Soviet Union." Well, he's partially right. They were independent, they were autonomous, they had their own territorial integrity, but they were also Warsaw Pact countries, which meant that they were controlled by the Soviet Union. A big blunder by Gerald Ford. In two polls immediately taken after the debate, Ford sagged from 45 to 42 and 41%, and he would bounce back in the final poll before the election, October 28th to the 30th, 1976. Ford had actually taken the lead. But Jimmy Carter wins. Jimmy Carter wins the election. He won, defeated in the vote, Ford by 2 percentage points. The electoral vote, closest since 1960. Carter got 23 states, 297 electoral votes. Ford won more states, but only 240 electoral votes, while one elector from Washington pledged to Ford voted for Reagan, so he got one vote. The Electoral College, you know what? Should be the popular vote, but it's not. And that goes back to the George Washington days, where the only people allowed to vote back then were landowners. Women couldn't vote, certainly slaves couldn't vote. The white man who owned land was the only one with money allowed to vote. Well, the United States and China have a very testy relationship today, extremely testy relationship. But China was opened up by Richard Nixon because Mao Zedong was looking at Richard Nixon with longing eyes in the late 1960s, hoping Nixon would win for a chance to open up a relationship with the United States because things were not going well with the Soviet Union. He dies on September 9th. Mao Zedong Vladimir Lenin, and Joseph Stalin were the three most influential communist figures of the Cold War. Mao was born in 1893. During the teens, 19 teens, he joined the nationalist movement against the royal government of China and foreigners who used to exploit China. And there is Mao, who's a little older at that point. In the 1920s, Mao lost faith in the leaders of the nationalist movement, came to believe that only a revolutionary change of Chinese society could bring freedom from Western domination. In 1921, he became one of the founding members of the Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP. Mao was constantly in danger of being arrested and execution by Chinese government forces. He split with his communist colleagues as they favored copying the Bolshevik revolution that brought communism to power in Russia. Mao insisted that the revolution in China would come from the country's peasants, not urban workers. Mao is a little older man. In 1933, he took control of the Communist Party. Through the 1930s into World War II, Mao's forces continued their attacks on the Chinese government. They were victorious in 1949, and the Communist People's Republic of China was declared that year. This is October 1st, 1949. Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong is now the dictator of Communist China. Communists gained control of mainland China and forced the leadership of the Republic of China to retreat to the island of Taiwan. And there's still a problem with Taiwan to these days. You know, you hear every once in a while that the Chinese are going after that island. They want to reclaim it. There's been a lasting and political military standoff. The ROC in Taiwan and the PCR in the mainland of China both say that they're the official legitimate government of China. Standing side by side, Chiang Kai-shek, Mao Zedong, 1945. Of course, Chiang Kai-shek would leave for Taiwan after Mao took over. The United States, which backed the nationalists, Chiang Kai-shek, Sungs, against invading Japanese forces during World War II, supports Chiang's exiled Republic of China government in Taipei. For more than 20 years, between 1949 and 1971, there were few contacts, limited trade, no diplomatic ties between mainland China and the United States. North Korea invades South Korea June 26, 1950. Now, when you look at that, what happened there was actually Joseph Stalin gave the go-ahead to North Korea to invade, but China was there as well. The Soviet-backed North Korean People's Army invaded South Korea on June 25th. The United Nations and the United States rushed to South Korea's defense. Mao sent his troops into Korea to battle the Americans. Dwight Eisenhower, there he is the President of the United States in 1953 when the truce is reached. The Korean War, has it ever ended? Yes or no? Yes or no? It has never ended. There's only been a truce. There's been never a treaty signed between the countries. Well, Eisenhower lifts the U.S. Navy blockade of Taiwan in 1953, leaving Chiang Kai-shek to deploy thousands of troops to two islands in the Taiwan Strait in August 1954. Mainland China's People's Liberation Army responds by shelling the islands. Washington signs a mutual defense treaty with Taipei and Chiang's nationalists. In the spring of 1955, the United States threatens a nuclear attack on China. Mao agrees to negotiate, claiming a limited victory after the nationalists withdraw from Dachin Island. Crisis would erupt in 1956 and 1996. A nuclear attack? Well, we didn't know about this nuclear attack until very, very recently, 1958. Ike and Chiang Kai-shek again. U.S. military planners pushed for nuclear strikes on mainland China in 1958 to protect Taiwan from invasion by communist forces. classified documents posted online, May 2021, by Daniel Ellsberg, who recently passed away, who published the Pentagon Papers in 1971. He blew the whistle on that just 2 years ago. U.S. planners also assumed that the Soviet Union would aid China and retaliate with nuclear weapons, a price they deemed worthy paying to protect Taiwan, according to the document. So how close were we to obliterating each other in 1958? Daniel Ellsberg's papers were correct. Pretty close. There was the Great Leap Forward. Mao Zedong, 1958, has a fallout with the Soviet Union, launches the Great Leap Forward, which was intended to modernize China's industrial capacity and increase agricultural production. But there was a problem. It was done for purely political reasons. There were natural disasters that hit China at that point, and there was no more aid from the Soviet Union, and that exasperated the situation. The Great Chinese Famine for 4 years, 58 to 62, is widely regarded as the deadliest famine and one of the greatest man-made disasters in human history, an estimated toll due to starvation that ranged in the tens of millions. Mao introduced drastic changes in farming policy, prohibiting farm ownership. Failure to abide by the policies led to punishment. Mao wanted people to make steel in their backyard. Hey, yeah, it's easy, I guess it's easy, get a furnace and make steel, so that China could catch up with the U.S. and Great Britain. The Dalai Lama, who is still around, the Dalai Lama, on April 29, 1959, he flees China. China's been trying to take over Tibet for a long time, and they finally get to the Dalai Lama. In Tibet, a widespread crackdown uprising, there's a widespread uprising in Lhasa. Thousands die in the ensuing crackdown by Mao's forces, and the Dalai Lama flees to India. The United States joins the United Nations in condemning Beijing in those days, for human rights abuses in Tibet, while the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, helps arm the Tibetan resistance beginning in the late 1950s. And then there's the Cultural Revolution in China in the mid-1960s, the little red book that he put out. At a conference in Peking, Mao released the May 16th notification. The text warned that the enemies of the communist cause had infiltrated the party in an attempt to restore capitalism. It also summarized Mao's ideological justification for the Cultural Revolution. And here is the Cultural Revolution, and there is the little red book. Student protesters in their teens and 20s formed a paramilitary group known as the Red Guards. Books and art destroyed. Museums ransacked. Streets were renamed with new revolutionary names and adorned with portraits and quotes of Chairman Mao. Temples, shrines, and other heritage sites were vandalized. Intellectuals, top party officials, and perceived bourgeois elements were labeled counter-revolutionary, subject to physical and psychological attacks. Clergy were arrested and sent to camps and monasteries destroyed. 1969, the Soviets have had enough of Mao Zedong and threatened to nuke him. They're going to blow him to smithereens. March 2nd, 1969, a group of China's People Liberation Army troops ambushed Soviet Union guards at Shambo Island. There would be another skirmish on March 15th. And Brezhnev said, we're going to just drop a bomb, and that'll be the end of that. Alexei Kosygin, who was the Prime Minister of Russia, or the emissary at that point, talks to Mao's assistant, Zhou Enlai. The Soviet Prime Minister Kosygin, on September 11, 1969, on his way back from the funeral of the Vietnamese leader Ho Chi Minh, North Vietnamese leader Ho Chi Minh, stops over in Beijing for talks with his Chinese counterpart, Zhou Enlai. The two premiers agreed to return ambassadors previously recalled and begin border negotiations. But Mao has his loving eyes looking at Richard Nixon. He can't trust Brezhnev, can't trust Kosygin. So is he going to trust Richard Nixon? Would you trust Richard Nixon? Well, he's going to do so. Chairman Mao believed in 1969 that ties with Americans might serve as a deterrent against the Russians. U.S. President Richard Nixon, oh, that was me, had made opening China the top priority of his administration. Oh, right there, right there. He used to have an office at Foley Square. He had an office, and the office, I was up in his office, was a miniature oval office, except he had flags flying all over the place in the office, and tons of pictures of him and Mao, and him and this guy, him and that guy. Right there, yes. Ping pong. Ping pong would open the door. Maybe, but it would. Ping pong. During the 1971 World Table Tennis Championships in Nagoya, Japan, 19-year-old player by the name of Glenn Cowan, who learned his game on the shores of Long Island at the beach clubs in New Rochelle. And he was, my wife knew who he was, and he was really one of the best table tennis players going. And he learned all of that in New Rochelle. Anyway, he hopped on the shuttle bus carrying the Chinese national team, and there he is meeting with the team. Chang Chizang, the team's greatest player, stepped forward, shook Cowan's hand, and spoke to him through an interpreter. The photographers around caught the incident on film, and they become the most unlikely of diplomats, these guys. They are on top of the world because they are opening China. And Mao Zedong surprises them and says, hey, you may not have a good table tennis team, and it wasn't, but you have won an all-expense trip to China. Well, before they said that they're going, they had to check with the American embassy. And they said, okay, and the American players got an all-expense paid trip, didn't have to pay any taxes on it, as their consolation prize to China. The unlikely diplomats, and they are in front of the Great Wall of China. And there's Henry Kissinger, who recently celebrated his 100th birthday meeting with Zhou Enlai. Nixon secretly sent Kissinger, the Secretary of State, to Peking to arrange a presidential visit to China. 7 months later, Nixon goes to China. The unlikely diplomats, a whole new ballgame. Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai said, never before in the history has a sport been so effectively used as a tool of international diplomacy. Nixon, oh, that we got changed the world. And there he is. Nixon goes to China. The meeting with Nixon was one of Mao's last great public successes. He's nearing 80 years old, and he's making less frequent appearances. He has Parkinson's disease, and the relationship between the United States and China begins. There's Gerald Ford meeting with Chairman Mao. Mao Zedong led the Chinese people through a long revolution that ruled the nation's communist government from its establishment in 1949, dies. And Wei Guofeng is his successor. He's the new chairman of the Communist Party in China, and one of his first tasks was ordering the arrest of the Gang of Four, which consisted of party officials accused of treasonous actions. Among them, Mao Zedong's widow. The arrests, along with Wei being in charge, ended the Cultural Revolution. Celebrate. You saw this, right? But you weren't down there. You weren't down there with the 2 million, right?
Right. No, I was up in an apartment.
You were up in an apartment, so you got to see all of this, right?
The ships and
Yeah, the ships, and also you were safe.
fireworks.
You weren't hemmed in like a sardine. Well, anyway, that was 47 years ago tomorrow, July 4th, 1976. The bicentennial was a series of events during the mid-1970s that paid tribute to the historic events leading up to the creation of the United States as an independent republic. The bicentennial culminated on Sunday, July 4th, 1976, with the 200th anniversary of the adoption of the Declaration of Independence. Like I said, Queen Elizabeth was in Boston joining the party. All's forgiven. There's the Queen and the King, and or rather Prince Philip, meeting with Gerald Ford and Betty Ford. All's forgiven. Apple computer. Anybody have an Apple computer? Use an Apple computer, Apple phone, or all that? It's the first. That's the first. On April 1st, 1976, the Apple Computer Company was founded by Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. Wozniak had just designed and created the Apple I, and his friend Jobs had the idea of selling it. It sold for $666.66. There were only 200 produced, but it was a commercial success, and the proceeds allowed Wozniak to work on the Apple II, which was released in 1977. The Entebbe raid rescued passengers back in Israel. The Israeli airborne commandos attacked Uganda's Entebbe airport and freed 103 hostages held by pro-Palestinian hijackers of an Air France plane. One Israeli, Benjamin Netanyahu's brother, Jonathan Netanyahu, was killed. Several Ugandan soldiers also killed on the raid. Netanyahu was commanding the rescue mission at the airport called Operation Entebbe. In South Africa, there's an uprising in Soweto. On June 16th, there was a protest on the streets in South Africa's economic capital in Johannesburg. Thousands of mostly black students lined the streets, refused to go to school until a law ordering that lessons be taught in Afrikaans, language deeply associated with the racist apartheid regime, ended. And that is 12-year-old Hector Peterson. He's a schoolboy, shot and killed, age 12, during the Soweto uprisings. South African police gave the official death toll from the June 16th uprising in 23, but the government-appointed Silly Commission inquiry put the death toll at 575 in September, blaming police for the majority of casualties. The protest rolled into a second day as students and police clashed with pupils stoning cars driven through Soweto. The protest continued for months, garnered international attention. That struggle would last for another 18 years. Apartheid and the Olympic boycott. That is Montreal. That is the airport of Montreal. And those are African athletes leaving because of apartheid and New Zealand's participation in the Olympics. 25 African countries skipped the 1976 Montreal Summer Olympics because New Zealand's rugby team played contests in apartheid South Africa. The African countries protested to the International Olympic Committee about the IOC's refusal to ban New Zealand from the 1976 Montreal Games and walked out. South Africa was barred from competing in the 1964, 1968 Olympics, and they were tossed out of the Olympic Committee's group of nations in 1970 because of apartheid. You might remember Nadia Comaneci from 1976, the gymnast that captured the hearts and minds of ABC network people and then yours, because she was on TV. She was a gymnast. 14-year-old Romanian gymnast Nadia Comaneci wins 5 gold medals in gymnastics at the Montreal Olympics. She became the first female gymnast ever to be awarded a perfect score of 10 for her uneven bar routine, and went on to earn a total of 7 perfect scores. That's the big O, as in OWE, not as in Olympic Stadium, the big O. That Olympics nearly boycotted Quebec, nearly bankrupted Quebec and Montreal. They spent so much money for it. It was part of a series of things that were done, like having Expo 67, the World's Fair, in Montreal in 1967, building a modern world-class subway system, which they did, and building that stadium for the Olympics. The legacy of the 1976 Montreal Olympics is debt. And when people are rallying against having an area bringing in an Olympics, they bring up Montreal. That is its legacy. The Olympic Stadium was supposed to cost $250 billion, $250 billion Canadian, but it ended up with a price tag of $1.4 billion Canadian. The city, province, and Canada didn't pay off the Montreal Olympics debt from '76 until November 2006, 30 years after the closing ceremonies. Isabella Perón, Argentina. The president of Argentina, Isabel Perón, is overthrown by a military coup on March 24th. She was the third wife of Juan Perón, who had been the Argentine president during the 1940s and 50s, and again from 1973 to 74 after his 18 years in exile. She was his vice president and took office after his death in 1974. She was the first woman president in the world, the first. While she's in power, well, it was a global problem with inflation. The economy suffered high inflation. She's also accused of sanctioning political murders and suspected of being responsible for the disappearance of hundreds of political dissidents. She was held under house arrest for 5 years. In 1981, she was convicted of corrupt practices, but paroled in the summer of that year, and then decided, I'm going to Spain, where she lived out her life. Son of Sam. Now, I was 20 years old back in 1976, and it was a popular practice. If you couldn't go to your house and go to the drive-in movie where I worked, you could do things at the drive-in movie, I guess. But all of a sudden, there were murders of women in cars making out with a guy, and the streets became thoroughly unsafe. P.S. JB, please inform all detectives working on the case that I wish them the best of luck. Keep them digging, drive on, think positive, get off your butts, knock on coffins, etc. Upon my capture, I promised to buy all the guys working on the case a new pair of shoes if I could get the money. Sincerely, Son of Sam. Well, on July 29th, David Berkowitz, known as the Son of Sam, lived down the road from here in Yonkers, committed the first of his murders in the outer boroughs of New York City. Over the next years, he would kill, again, 5 more times, injured at least 7. His attacks happened at night. Popular discos in Queens and the Bronx became ghost towns. The Ebola outbreak in Africa. Factory storekeeper in Nazareth, township of Sudan, becomes ill on June 27th. 5 days later, he dies. The world's first recorded Ebola virus epidemic begins, making its way through the area. By the time the epidemic is over, 284 cases are reported, about half of the victims dying from the disease. Vaccines to protect against Ebola have been developed, but there have been outbreaks ever since then. Legionnaire disease, Philadelphia. I'm hanging around Philadelphia that summer, and people in Philadelphia are like, what's going on here? Well, in late July, American Legionnaires returning from a state convention in Philadelphia began to fall ill with mysterious symptoms. Pneumonia, fevers of 107. By early August, news organizations across the country were reporting that 6 to 14 of the men in Pennsylvania had died. Others were in hospitals fighting for their lives. Legionnaire's disease is a severe form of pneumonia. About 5,000 people in the U.S. get it every year. It is treatable. Swine flu. Get your swine flu shot. I never got a swine flu shot. I'm supposed to, but I never did. An outbreak of swine flu, influenza A virus subtype H1N1. Fort Dix, New Jersey caused 1 death, hospitalized 13, and led to a mass immunization program. After the program began, the vaccine was associated with an increase in the reports of Guillain-Barré syndrome, which can cause paralysis, respiratory arrest, and death. The immunization program was ended after about 25% of the population had been administered the vaccine. The swine flu strain spotted at Fort Dix was not dangerous, and there would be no pandemic. Richard Krause, director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, from 1974 to 1975 to 1984, wrote that the government's response to the swine flu outbreak was considered too fast. Mars seen by Viking 1. Been a lot of spacecrafts that have gone to Mars over the years, and since then as well. NASA's Viking 1 lander arrives at Mars during July. The Viking 1 lander mission was to land on the Martian surface in order to conduct scientific experiments and take photos. The experiments including testing the atmosphere, soil, and looking for signs of life on the planet. That spacecraft remained operational until November of 1982. CN Tower, that's one foggy September morning, 2017. CN Tower. CN Tower in Toronto is completed, and at the time was the tallest freestanding structure in the world, and that would last for 35 years. Hey, you ever see these things around, the $2 bills? They're around. Does anybody use them though? Nobody uses them. Nobody uses them at all. It's from my house, that one. On November 3rd, 1975, Secretary of Treasury William E. Simon announced the reissuance of the $2 note as a cost-saving measure. Save on coins. The $2 notes will be available from banks on April 13th, Thomas Jefferson's birthday. Jefferson was 233 years old that day. Rocky. How many of you watched the movie Rocky? You're doing the Rocky thing. You like the Rocky series? You love the Rocky series? You like Sylvester Stallone? Do you know who saved Rocky from...
I like the music too.
You like the music too?
Yeah.
Do you know who saved Rocky from the scrap heap? The Fonz, Henry Winkler. He was good friends with Sylvester Stallone. And he brought the script to ABC. ABC was interested, but they told Stallone, you're not part of this anymore. You know, you're not part of it. We're going to write it. And he calls, and Henry Winkler calls Sylvester Stallone and says, they don't want you. And Sylvester Stallone begs him, stop them. I want it back.
Yeah.
And the only reason that it got back was who was the biggest star at ABC at that point? The Fonz, Henry Winkler. And he used his capital and he bailed out his friend, Sylvester Stallone. Rocky's released in the United States in December. It's written by Sylvester Stallone, who starred in the title role. The cast included Carl Weathers, Tyler Schei, Burgess Meredith, and Burt Young, and it's all about this underdog boxer by the name of Rocky Balboa and his high-profile match against the champion Apollo Creed. And Rocky Balboa may have been based on a boxer by the name of Chuck Webner. That's the best-selling portrait ever. Farrah Fawcett. And if you look real closely, like some of the guys, I never did this, but I never looked real closely at the poster. But it was either a cold day or she was excited about something that you could see in that poster. Like I said, I never looked. I was told that. I mean, guys like Rick told me this and Chuck told me this. I never saw it. The poster was released in 1976. That was the year Fawcett became popular through her role in the TV series Charlie's Angels. The poster became a great success, selling 6 million copies in 1976 and 77. So there were a lot of Chucks and Ricks that I knew who bought the poster. I never bought the poster. My girlfriend bought the poster, though. She thought that I'd like it. I said, why? I have you. Well, she had me until Christmas Day, 1976. We're at the movie theater in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, watching A Star is Born with Chris Christopherson and Barbara Streisand. In the middle of that movie, I said, why am I here? And that was it. The romance was over. Anyway, it sold 12 million copies. It might be the best-selling poster ever. 2 years after her death in 2011, Farrah Fawcett died in 2009, Farrah Fawcett's red swimsuit and a copy of her poster were donated to the Smithsonian National Museum of American History and joined its collection of culturally significant objects, which included Archie Bunker's chair from All in the Family. I don't know if you remember Stretch Armstrong. Ever remember Stretch Armstrong? It was a doll for kids. It was born in the idea book of toy maker Jesse D. Horowitz. 1974, his plan was to make a stretch man in 2 body types, the muscle-bound blonde and the sumo wrestler. But that, well, he couldn't really do either one of them. But he figured it out. Used corn syrup to get Stretch to work. Stretch retired in 1980, but in 2017, Stretch Armstrong was back and landed on the must-have toys for kids list. The American Basketball Association is done. Julius Erving. On June 17th, representatives from the National Basketball Association and the American Basketball Association signed on a deal which saw 4 ABA teams: the New York Nets, Denver Nuggets, Indiana Pacers, and San Antonio Spurs join the 18-team NBA. 2 teams didn't make the cut: Spurs of St. Louis and the Kentucky Colonels. The 4 ABA teams paid $3.2 million each to join the league. That's not even the minimum salary in the NBA. Well, it's a little higher than the minimum salary today. The Nets owner, Roy Bowe, paid an additional $4.8 million, paid Madison Square Garden's owners in Gulf and Devour, rather Gulf and Western, because he invaded the New York Knicks territory. The ABA lasted 9 years. It's Joe Namath and me, my friend Bruce Morton, 1988, when I had hair and Joe had this wig that he wore, and that's my buddy Bruce. He played his last game with the Jets in 1976. He was a pro football New York icon because he guaranteed the Jets would win the Super Bowl in 1969. He came through, changed the football industry, but the NFL stands for not for long. The Jets decided to waive Namath after the 1976 season. The team was losing. Time for a change. Joe was 33. He hooked up with Los Angeles. That's the legacy. That's what I looked like in 1976. Only time I had a beard. And it was, I look at this picture now and say, well, it's a time. And there's me last year, Orangetown, New York. I have a piece of me buried in there. I'm in a time capsule as part of the Orangetown, New York American Revolution Bicentennial. 1981, I was the news director of a radio station, WGRC in Rockland County, and the Bicentennial Commission asked me for some things like tape. I don't know if that's going to survive when it's opened up in 2081, which is when it's supposed to be opened up. Also a couple scripts and also something else from our radio station, but it's buried there, which I have to tell my grandkids. Anyway, it was buried on May 21st, 1981. Now you might ask why it was buried in 1981, not 1976. Well, the bicentennial actually lasted from 1976 till 1983. The reason why? Commemorating the 7 years of the Revolutionary War. So there were bicentennial events that took place past 1976, and a newscast from WGRC Radio was buried in that capsule. The legacy: Carter was a one-term president. China was not that prominent on the world stage yet. Apple would become a technology giant. Ebola and Legionnaire's disease are still circulating. Soweto uprising was the beginning of the end of apartheid. The Montreal Olympic boycott brought attention to the apartheid. The Middle East remains a dangerous neighborhood. Rocky is one of the best known movie franchises in history. NBA franchises are worth billions of dollars, and Mars is still being visited by American satellites and other satellites. That's it. Any questions, any comments? Your turn. Nothing? So I know where you were in 1976. Where were you on July 4th, 1976, remember?
Right? No, I think I was at the waterfront
Oh.
in Jersey.
Oh, in
watching
Jersey.
the
Oh,
fireworks.
I was at a baseball game. Mets and Cubs. Anybody else? Yeah.
My question is, can you give us the year when, and obviously this could be a fairly complicated question, but the year in which they got involved in the occupation of a dozen flights to the U.S. You know, when they took,
Kuwait?
when they they had 2 dozen flights that were both brought down because of being hassled.
Those two you're talking about September 11th?
Not December 11th, but whenever those flights were occupied and brought down,
Yeah, it was 2001,
and they
September
all
11th.
survived.
Oh, no, I don't even know about that one.
After the meeting, so.
Yeah. It wouldn't be on this one, so.
Okay.
Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you.
Hope I brought back some memories.
Yeah.